He poured hot coffee on a black intern. Hours later, she was the one who fired him. "Are you blind?" Brian's voice exploded across the cafe, loud enough to make 3 customers turn. Talia froze, holding the stack of files he told her to bring. "I said put it on the counter, not on me," he barked, stepping closer. Then he smirked, that ugly kind of smirk, and said, "You people can't follow simple instructions." Before Talia could speak, before she could even breathe, he lifted his cup and poured hot coffee all over her blouse. Gasps filled the room. A woman shouted, "What is wrong with you?" But Brian just laughed and said, "Consider it a lesson. Interns like you need discipline." He had no idea that the intern he just humiliated in front of everyone was the one who would fire him before the day ended. Welcome to Black Courageous Stories, a home for our voices, our strength, and our truth. Tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe if you stand with justice, dignity, and humanity. And tell us, where are you watching from? Let's connect with you. The morning had started like any other at Riverside Corporate Center's ground floor cafe. Steam rose from freshly brewed coffee, keyboards clicked in the adjacent workspaces, and the usual mixture of employees and clients moved through their routines. But Brian Mitchell, Regional Operations Manager, was already in one of his moods. At 42, Brian carried himself with the swagger of a man who believed his position gave him license to treat people however he pleased. His expensive suit couldn't mask the ugliness that lived just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Talia Williams had been working at the company for exactly 3 days, or at least that's what everyone believed. At 28, she moved with a quiet confidence that some people mistook for submission. She had learned long ago that observation was more powerful than confrontation, that patience often revealed more than immediate action ever could. The coffee incident wasn't spontaneous, it was calculated. After pouring the scalding liquid down Talia's blouse, Brian watched her reaction with sick satisfaction. The entire cafe had gone silent. A businessman in the corner lowered his phone. 2 women at a table near the window stared in horror. Even the barista behind the counter had stopped mid-motion, her mouth hanging open. "Clean that up," Brian said, gesturing at the coffee now pooling on the floor around Talia's feet. "And next time, maybe you'll pay attention when I'm giving you instructions." Talia looked down at her ruined blouse, then back up at Brian. Her expression was unreadable, not angry, not hurt, just observant, like she was filing away every detail of this moment for future reference. "Of course, Mr. Mitchell," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the humiliation. Something about her calm response irritated him further. He had expected tears, apologies, maybe even her to quit on the spot. Instead, she simply walked to the counter, grabbed a handful of napkins, and began cleaning up the mess he had created. The other customers exchanged uncomfortable glances. A few pulled out their phones, though none were brave enough to intervene directly. The woman who had initially shouted in Talia's defense now sat rigid in her chair, clearly wanting to help but unsure how. "That's what I thought," Brian muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. He straightened his tie and walked toward the elevator, leaving Talia to deal with the aftermath of his cruelty. But as he waited for the elevator doors to open, he couldn't shake the image of Talia's face. There had been something in her eyes, something that suggested this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Marcus, a 24-year-old barista who had witnessed the entire incident, approached Talia cautiously. "Are you okay? That was really messed up." Talia looked up from where she was still cleaning. "I'm fine. Thank you for asking." "He's done stuff like this before," Marcus whispered, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. "Not the coffee thing, but, he treats people differently." "Differently how?" Marcus hesitated, then leaned closer. "Let's just say he only gets that aggressive with certain employees, if you know what I mean." Talia nodded slowly. She knew exactly what he meant. As she finished cleaning up the spilled coffee, Talia's mind was already working. She had seen enough in 3 days to understand that Brian Mitchell's behavior wasn't aberrant. It was systematic. The coffee incident was just the most visible symptom of a much deeper problem. The elevator doors closed behind Brian, and he rode up to the 15th floor with a satisfied smirk on his face. In his mind, he had just put an uppity intern in her place. He had no way of knowing that the woman he had just humiliated was about to become the architect of his downfall. What would you do if someone publicly humiliated you at work? Would you fight back immediately, or would you play the long game like Talia? Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments, because what happens next will make you question everything you think you know about workplace justice. 3 hours after the coffee incident, Talia sat in the company break room, now wearing a spare blouse she kept in her car. Her original shirt was ruined beyond repair, but she had carefully photographed the stains before changing. Evidence has a way of becoming important later. She wasn't alone. Word of Brian's public display had spread quickly through the building, and several employees had quietly approached her throughout the morning. What she learned painted a picture far more disturbing than a single moment of workplace cruelty. "He's been doing this for 2 years, whispered Janet, a 35-year-old accounting clerk who kept glancing over her shoulder as she spoke. "But it's never random. He targets specific people." "What do you mean, specific people?" Talia asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Janet lowered her voice even further. "Black employees, Latino employees, anyone he thinks he can get away with bullying." Another voice joined the conversation. "He got Keisha fired last month," said David, a maintenance worker who had been with the company for 8 years. "Made up some story about her being late too often, but I saw the timesheet records. She was never late. Not once." "And before that, it was Jerome in IT," added Janet. "Brian claimed he was underperforming, but Jerome had the best customer satisfaction ratings in the entire department." As the stories poured out, Talia began to see the full scope of Brian's systematic harassment. It wasn't just occasional rudeness or bad management. It was a deliberate campaign of intimidation designed to push certain employees out of the company. "Why hasn't anyone reported this?" Talia asked. The question was met with bitter laughs and resigned shrugs. "Reported to who?" David said. "Brian's golf buddies with half the executives in this building, and HR... well, let's just say they're not exactly known for taking our side." Janet nodded grimly. 2 people tried to file complaints. Both got transferred to different departments within a month. Worse schedules, lower pay, more demanding supervisors. The message was pretty clear. "So he just gets away with it?" "Until now, yeah," said David. "But something tells me you're different." As if summoned by their conversation, Brian's voice echoed down the hallway. "Where's my intern? I have work that needs to be done." The group immediately dispersed, each person finding urgent reasons to be elsewhere. Talia took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward Brian's office. She found him behind his desk, feet up, scrolling through his phone with the casual arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. "There you are," he said without looking up. "I need you to reorganize the filing system in the storage room, all of it, alphabetically." It was busy work, the kind of meaningless task designed to humiliate rather than accomplish anything productive. The storage room contained thousands of files, many dating back decades. Organizing them alphabetically would take days. "Of course, Mr. Mitchell. Should I prioritize any particular?" "Just do what I told you to do," he snapped, finally looking up from his phone. "And maybe this time you can manage not to screw it up." As Talia walked toward the storage room, she passed Melissa, a young Latina woman who worked in customer service. Melissa's eyes were red-rimmed, and she was clutching a tissue. "Are you all right?" Talia asked softly. Melissa glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "He just called me into his office, told me I was too emotional for customer service work. Said maybe I should consider finding a job that was better suited to my temperament." "What did you say?" "Nothing. What could I say? He's management. I need this job." Melissa wiped her eyes. "But the way he said it, the way he looked at me, it wasn't about my work performance. It was about who I am." Talia placed a gentle hand on Melissa's shoulder. "You're right. It wasn't about your performance." That afternoon, while pretending to organize files in the storage room, Talia made a series of phone calls to former employees who had been let go under mysterious circumstances, to current employees who had witnessed Brian's behavior but were too afraid to speak up officially, to managers in other departments who had heard rumors but never seen concrete evidence. What emerged was a pattern of systematic discrimination that went far beyond inappropriate comments or unfair treatment. Brian Mitchell wasn't just a bad manager, he was actively using his position to create a hostile work environment for employees of color. But patterns, Talia knew, were only useful if someone was in a position to act on them. And for that to happen, she needed to reveal exactly who she was and why she was really there. As closing time approached, Brian appeared in the doorway of the storage room. "Still working? Good. Maybe you're finally learning what it means to take initiative." Talia looked up from the stack of files she'd been carefully photographing. "I'm learning quite a lot, actually." "Is that so?" Brian leaned against the doorframe, blocking her exit. "And what exactly are you learning?" "That some lessons are more valuable than others." Something in her tone made Brian's smirk falter slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Just make sure you remember your place here. Interns come and go, but management positions are permanent." After he left, Talia allowed herself a small smile. Brian Mitchell had no idea just how temporary his management position was about to become. The next phase of her plan was already in motion, and by tomorrow morning, everything would change. But first, she needed to gather one more piece of evidence, the kind that would make denial impossible and justice inevitable. Brian thought he was teaching her about power dynamics and workplace hierarchy. What he was actually doing was providing her with everything she needed to destroy his career. Have you ever witnessed systematic discrimination at work but felt powerless to stop it? The next part of this story will show you exactly how one person can bring down an entire system of abuse. Make sure you're subscribed, because what Talia does next will completely flip the script on workplace bullying. The following morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that makes even difficult decisions seem inevitable. Talia arrived at work 30 minutes early, as had become her habit. But unlike previous days, she wasn't there to organize files or fetch coffee. Today, she had appointments. Her first meeting was with Linda Harrison, the night security supervisor who had worked at Riverside Corporate Center for 12 years. Linda had seen everything: the late-night incidents, the weekend confrontations, the moments when Brian thought no witnesses were around. "He's gotten bolder recently," Linda explained as they sat in the empty cafeteria. "Last month, I heard him on the phone with someone, complaining about having to hire diversity candidates to meet company quotas. Said it was dragging down the quality of the workforce." "You heard this directly?" "Clear as day. He was in his office, thought the building was empty, but I was doing security rounds." Linda paused, then added, "I've been keeping notes, dates, times, what I observed. My supervisor told me to mind my own business, but some things you can't just ignore." Talia's second appointment was with Dr. Sarah Chen, the company's former diversity and inclusion coordinator who had left 6 months earlier under mysterious circumstances. They met at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the office, neutral territory where Sarah felt safe to speak freely. "Brian saw me as a threat from day one," Sarah explained, stirring her latte absently. "Every initiative I proposed, every training session I scheduled, every policy recommendation I made, he found ways to undermine it. Can you give me specific examples?" "The unconscious bias training sessions? He scheduled mandatory department meetings at the same time, making it impossible for his staff to attend. The mentorship program for employees of color? He suddenly implemented a new project deadline system that made it impossible for anyone to take time for mentoring activities." Sarah leaned forward, her voice intense, but the worst part wasn't what he did officially, it was the comments. The jokes. The way he made it clear that anyone who participated in diversity initiatives was marking themselves as a troublemaker. "Is that why you left?" "I left because I realized the company wasn't interested in actual change. They wanted the appearance of diversity without addressing the systems that prevented it. And Brian was the embodiment of that system." By lunchtime, Talia had spoken with 7 current employees, 4 former employees, 2 security supervisors, and 1 very nervous HR representative who had been documenting Brian's behavior for months but felt powerless to act on it. The picture that emerged was clear. Brian Mitchell had spent 2 years systematically creating a hostile work environment for employees of color, using his position to intimidate, harass, and ultimately drive away anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of acceptable. But patterns and testimonies were only part of what Talia needed. She required concrete evidence, the kind that would make denial impossible. That afternoon, she found it. While Brian was at lunch, Talia used her authorized access to review personnel files. What she discovered was even worse than she had anticipated. Over the past 18 months, 12 employees of color had been terminated or had quit under pressure. Their performance reviews, dating back years, showed consistently high ratings right up until Brian became their supervisor. Then, suddenly, their evaluations plummeted. Productivity concerns appeared. Attitude problems were documented. Within months, they were gone. But the white employees in the same department? Their reviews remained consistently positive. Their job security was never questioned. Their mistakes were overlooked or attributed to external factors. The statistical improbability of this pattern was staggering. It wasn't just discrimination. It was systematic purging, carried out with the calculated precision of someone who understood exactly how to game the system. As Talia documented the personnel records, her phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus, the barista. "He's back early. Coming up in the elevator now." Talia quickly secured the files and returned to the storage room, where she had strategically positioned herself to overhear Brian's afternoon phone conversations. His office was adjacent to the storage area, and the thin walls meant that anyone inside could hear everything clearly. At 2:30 p.m., Brian's phone rang. "Mitchell here. Oh, hey Tom. Yeah, the diversity hire thing is getting ridiculous. I know, right? Corporate keeps pushing these quotas, but they don't have to deal with the consequences." Talia carefully activated the recording app on her phone. "I'm telling you, the quality of work has gone downhill since they started this inclusion nonsense. These people just don't have the same work ethic. No, I can't say that officially, but between you and me." The conversation continued for 15 minutes. Brian discussed strategies for managing out employees who didn't meet his unstated criteria. He complained about having to babysit workers who he claimed were only hired to meet diversity requirements. He even bragged about the coffee incident, describing it as a necessary lesson in respect and hierarchy. By the time he hung up, Talia had captured enough evidence to end his career 10 times over. But she wasn't finished. At 4 p.m., Brian called her into his office for what he described as a performance evaluation. It was clearly designed as another humiliation session, an opportunity for him to assert his dominance and remind her of her supposed place in the company hierarchy. "Sit down," he commanded, not bothering to look up from his computer screen. Talia sat, her phone discreetly recording everything. "Your work has been adequate," he began, finally looking at her with that familiar condescending expression. "But I have some concerns about your attitude." "My attitude? You seem to think you're here to observe and take notes rather than do the work you're assigned. That kind of entitlement doesn't fly in a professional environment." Brian leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself. "Maybe it's a cultural thing. Maybe you come from a place where showing initiative is discouraged. But here, we expect people to follow instructions without question." The racist implications were unmistakable, but Brian had carefully phrased his comments to maintain plausible deniability. It was the language of someone who had perfected the art of discrimination without leaving obvious fingerprints. "I see," Talia said calmly. "Do you? Because I'm not sure you do." Brian's voice hardened. "This company has standards, high standards, and if you can't meet them, there are plenty of other people who would be grateful for the opportunity. People like me. People who understand what it means to work hard and show respect for authority." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Brian making increasingly inflammatory comments while maintaining his veneer of professional conduct. He criticized her attitude, questioned her qualifications, and made several remarks that could only be interpreted as racially motivated. Through it all, Talia remained calm, asking occasional clarifying questions that prompted him to elaborate on his most damaging statements. She was conducting an interrogation disguised as a performance review, and Brian was too arrogant to realize he was being systematically dismantled. When the meeting ended, Brian felt victorious. He had put the uppity intern in her place, reminded her of the power dynamics at play, and established clear expectations for future behavior. What he had actually done was provide Talia with everything she needed to destroy him. As she left his office, Talia checked her phone. The recording was crystal clear. 43 minutes of discriminatory comments, racist implications, and explicit threats to her job security. Combined with the personnel files, witness testimonies, security footage from the coffee incident, and documented pattern of systematic harassment, she now had enough evidence to bring down not just Brian, but the entire system that had protected him for so long. But first, she needed to make one final revelation, one that would ensure Brian understood exactly who he had been dealing with all along. The next morning would bring justice, but it would also bring something Brian Mitchell had never experienced in his entire career: accountability. Ever wonder what it feels like to watch a bully realize they've picked on the wrong person? Tomorrow's confrontation will show you exactly what happens when systematic racism meets unstoppable justice. Subscribe now, because the final act of this story will leave you cheering for workplace equality. Friday morning arrived with an unusual energy crackling through Riverside Corporate Center. Talia Williams walked through the lobby at exactly 8:30 a.m., but this time she wasn't alone. Two people in professional attire accompanied her, their badges identifying them as representatives from the Corporate Compliance Department. Brian Mitchell was already at his desk, scrolling through emails and sipping his morning coffee from the same cup he had used to humiliate Talia just 4 days earlier. He had no idea that everything was about to change. "Mr. Mitchell," Talia's voice came from his doorway. He looked up, annoyed by the interruption. "What is it now? And who are these people?" "I need to speak with you. It's important." Brian's eyes narrowed as he noticed the two compliance officers. Something was wrong. The dynamic had shifted in a way he couldn't quite identify, but it made him uncomfortable. "Whatever it is, make it quick. I have a department meeting in 20 minutes. "Actually," Talia said, stepping into his office, "you'll want to cancel that meeting." The compliance officers followed her inside, and one of them quietly closed the door behind them. The sound of the latch clicking shut seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly tense silence. "What's going on here?" Brian demanded, his voice carrying the first hint of uncertainty he had shown all week. Talia walked to his desk and placed a thick manila folder directly in front of him. "We need to talk about your management practices, Mr. Mitchell." "My management practices?" Brian forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "Who are you to question my management practices? You're just an intern." That's when Talia reached into her jacket and withdrew her identification badge. Not the temporary intern badge she had been wearing all week, but her real credentials. She placed it on the desk next to the folder. Brian's eyes focused on the badge, and the color drained from his face. "Senior Compliance Officer, Talia Williams," she said calmly. "Corporate Discrimination Investigation Unit. And no, Mr. Mitchell, I'm not an intern." The silence that followed was profound. Brian stared at the badge as if it were a venomous snake, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. That's impossible," he stammered. "You've been here all week. You were doing filing, organizing, getting coffee." "I was conducting an undercover investigation into reports of systematic discrimination in this department," Talia replied. "Reports that, as of this morning, I have comprehensively confirmed." One of the compliance officers stepped forward. "Mr. Mitchell, you're being placed on immediate administrative suspension pending a full review of your conduct." "This is ridiculous." Brian's voice cracked slightly. "You can't just... what evidence could you possibly have? I've never done anything wrong." Talia opened the manila folder and began removing documents. "Let's start with Exhibit A, security footage from Monday morning, showing you deliberately pouring hot coffee on my clothing while making racially charged comments." She placed the first photograph on his desk. Brian's face went white as he saw himself, captured in perfect detail, dumping coffee down Talia's shirt. Exhibit B, recorded testimony from 7 current employees and 4 former employees, all detailing a pattern of discriminatory treatment. More documents appeared on the desk. Brian's hands began to tremble slightly. Exhibit C, personnel files showing that 12 employees of color have been terminated or forced to quit under your supervision, while white employees with similar or worse performance records have been retained and promoted. That's just coincidence," Brian protested weakly. "Performance is performance. I don't see color." Exhibit D, Talia continued relentlessly, is particularly interesting. It's a 43-minute recording of our conversation yesterday afternoon, in which you made numerous discriminatory statements and threatened my employment based on what you described as cultural differences. She placed a small digital recorder on the desk and pressed play. Brian's own voice filled the room. Maybe it's a cultural thing. Maybe you come from a place where showing initiative is discouraged. Turn it off, Brian said quickly. I didn't mean that was taken out of context. And Exhibit E, Talia said, ignoring his protests, is a recording of your phone conversation with Tom Henderson from the regional office, in which you explicitly discussed strategies for managing out diversity hires and complained about having to work with people who, in your words, don't have the same work ethic. She played another clip. These people just don't have the same work ethic. The quality of work has gone downhill since they started this inclusion nonsense. Brian slumped in his chair as if the air had been let out of him. You can't use that. That was a private conversation. Recorded in a company office, during company time, discussing company personnel matters, the second compliance officer noted, completely admissible in any disciplinary hearing. Talia gathered the documents and returned them to the folder. Mr. Mitchell, in my 15 years of investigating workplace discrimination, I've rarely encountered a case this clear-cut. You have systematically created a hostile work environment for employees of color, used your position to intimidate and harass protected classes of workers, and violated numerous federal and state employment laws. I want to speak to my supervisor, Brian said desperately. This is all a misunderstanding. I've been with this company for 8 years. 8 years. Your supervisor has been briefed, one of the compliance officers replied. He's the one who authorized this investigation after receiving multiple complaints about your department's unusual turnover rates. The room fell silent except for the sound of Brian's labored breathing. Everything he had built, every assumption he had made about his untouchable position, every belief he held about his own importance, it was all crumbling around him. What happens now? He asked quietly. Talia looked at him with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the week, even when he was pouring coffee on her shirt and making racist comments. Now, Mr. Mitchell, you learn what accountability looks like. She turned to the compliance officers. I believe we have everything we need for the formal hearing. As they prepared to leave, Brian made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Wait, this isn't fair. You tricked me. You were pretending to be someone you weren't. Talia paused at the door and looked back at him. Mr. Mitchell, I was never pretending to be anything other than a black woman in your workplace. Everything else was just your own assumptions. She smiled, not with cruelty, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just delivered long overdue justice. You taught me quite a lot this week, she added, about power, about respect, about what happens when people think they're untouchable. As she walked out of his office, Brian realized that the woman he had tried to humiliate, intimidate, and drive away was the same woman who now held his career in her hands, and she had just crushed it completely. The investigation was over, the evidence was overwhelming, and Brian Mitchell was about to discover that actions have consequences, especially when those actions are built on a foundation of systematic racism and abuse of power. Justice, it turned out, had been wearing an intern badge all along. Have you ever seen someone get exactly what they deserved after years of getting away with terrible behavior? The final confrontation is coming next, and it will restore your faith in workplace justice. Hit subscribe, because what happens in the last act will give you chills. The conference room on the 15th floor had never felt smaller. Brian Mitchell sat alone at one end of the long mahogany table, his expensive suit wrinkled from a sleepless night, his hands clasped tightly to keep them from shaking. Across from him sat a panel that would determine his fate: Talia Williams, 2 compliance officers, the regional HR director, and his former supervisor, Michael Chen. The past 72 hours had been a nightmare from which Brian couldn't wake up. Word of his suspension had spread through the building like wildfire. Employees he had intimidated for months now walked past his empty office with knowing looks. The power he had wielded so carelessly had evaporated overnight. This hearing will determine your employment status with Riverside Corporate Center, announced Patricia Reeves, the senior HR director. Ms. Williams will present her findings, and you will have an opportunity to respond. Talia opened her folder, the same manila folder that had destroyed his world 3 days ago. Over the course of 5 days, I documented a systematic pattern of discriminatory behavior that violates federal employment law, company policy, and basic human decency. She began with the coffee incident, playing the security footage on the room's large monitor. Brian watched himself pour hot coffee down her shirt, heard his own voice saying, "You people can't follow simple instructions," and saw the shocked faces of the customers who witnessed his cruelty. This wasn't a moment of anger, Talia explained calmly. It was a calculated act of humiliation designed to assert dominance through racial intimidation. Brian shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It was a mistake. I was having a bad morning, and Let's examine whether this was truly isolated behavior, Talia interrupted, advancing to the next slide. The screen filled with a chart showing employment statistics for Brian's department over the past 2 years. The data was damning, a 78% turnover rate among employees of color, compared to just 12% among white employees. Performance evaluations that mysteriously declined only after employees began reporting to Brian. Disciplinary actions that followed a clear racial pattern. 12 employees of color have left this department under your supervision, Talia continued. Each one was a skilled professional with years of positive performance reviews. Each one began experiencing performance problems only after you became their manager. She clicked to the next slide, showing individual cases. Keisha Washington, 5 years of exemplary reviews, promoted twice, Employee of the Month 3 times. After 8 months under your supervision, she was terminated for chronic lateness, despite time records showing she was actually early most days. Brian's supervisor, Michael Chen, leaned forward. "Brian, I'm seeing these statistics for the first time. How do you explain this pattern?" "It's not a pattern," Brian said weakly. "Sometimes employees just don't work out. Performance standards are performance standards." Jerome Martinez, Talia continued, worked in IT for 6 years, customer satisfaction ratings consistently above 95%. 3 months after you began overseeing his department's projects, he was written up for poor communication skills and difficulty working with clients. She looked directly at Brian. The same clients who had praised his work for years suddenly found him difficult to work with. "What changed, Mr. Mitchell?" The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Brian couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Talia advanced to her audio evidence. "This recording was made during a phone conversation you had with Tom Henderson from the regional office. You believed you were speaking privately." Brian's voice filled the room. "The diversity hire thing is getting ridiculous. These people just don't have the same work ethic. I can't say that officially, but between you and me..." Patricia Reeves stopped the recording. "Mr. Mitchell, you're explicitly discussing strategies to circumvent anti-discrimination policies." "That was taken out of context," Brian protested. "I was just expressing frustration about..." "About what?" Talia asked sharply. "About having to work with Black and Latino colleagues? About being required to treat all employees fairly regardless of their race?" She played another clip. "The quality of work has gone downhill since they started this inclusion nonsense." Michael Chen shook his head in disgust. "Brian, I don't even know how to respond to this." "But perhaps most revealing," Talia said, "was our conversation in your office yesterday when you thought you were disciplining an intern who had no power to challenge you." She played the recording of their meeting, letting Brian's words speak for themselves. "Maybe it's a cultural thing. Maybe you come from a place where showing initiative is discouraged. You made assumptions about my background, my capabilities, and my work ethic based entirely on my race," Talia said. "Then you used those assumptions to justify treating me with contempt and disrespect." Brian tried one last desperate defense. "I treat everyone the same. I'm not racist. I have friends who are." "Mr. Mitchell," Talia interrupted, her voice cutting through his protest like a blade. "Your actions speak louder than your denials." She clicked to her final slide, showing photographs from the company's diversity training sessions over the past 2 years. You attended 4 mandatory anti-discrimination workshops. You signed acknowledgement forms stating you understood company policy. You received written warnings about appropriate workplace conduct. The photos showed Brian in each training session looking bored, checking his phone, or whispering to colleagues. Yet, somehow, you interpreted these trainings as suggestions rather than requirements. Patricia Reeves consulted her notes. Mr. Mitchell, the evidence against you is overwhelming. Physical assault, creating a hostile work environment, systematic discrimination, violation of federal employment law. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Brian looked around the room at faces that had once shown him deference and respect. Now he saw only disappointment, disgust, and determination to see justice served. This isn't fair, he said finally. She tricked me. She was pretending to be an intern when she was really investigating me. It's entrapment. Entrapment, Talia replied calmly. Would be if I had encouraged you to discriminate against me. Instead, I simply existed in your workplace as a black woman, and your true character revealed itself. She leaned forward slightly. Mr. Mitchell, every racist comment, every discriminatory action, every moment of cruelty, that all came from you. I didn't make you pour coffee on my shirt. I didn't make you question my intelligence or work ethic. I didn't make you create a hostile work environment for employees who didn't look like you. All I did, she continued, was document the behavior you chose to display when you thought there would be no consequences. The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled over everyone present. Patricia Reeves closed her folder. Mr. Mitchell, effective immediately, your employment with Riverside Corporate Center is terminated. Security will escort you from the building, and you have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings. You can't do this, Brian said, his voice breaking. I have a mortgage. I have kids. This company is my career. You should have thought about that, Michael Chen replied, before you decided that terrorizing your colleagues was an acceptable management strategy. As security officers appeared at the door, Brian made one final desperate plea. Please, I can change. I can do better. I'll take sensitivity training, anger management, whatever you want. Talia looked at him with something that might have been pity. Mr. Mitchell, change requires acknowledgement. You can't fix behavior you refuse to admit is wrong. She stood as the security officers approached Brian's chair. Besides, the employees you drove away deserved better than having to wait for you to become a decent human being. Brian was escorted from the room in silence, his 8-year career ending in the same conference room where he had once confidently discussed quarterly performance metrics and departmental goals. After he was gone, Patricia Reeves turned to Talia. Excellent work, Ms. Williams. Your investigation was thorough, professional, and will help ensure this company creates a genuinely inclusive environment. What happens to the employees he targeted? Talia asked. We'll be reaching out to former employees who were unjustly terminated, offering reinstatement and back pay. Current employees will receive additional support and training opportunities. As the meeting concluded, Talia gathered her files and prepared to leave. Her work at Riverside Corporate Center was finished, but the impact would last far beyond her investigation. Word of Brian's termination spread through the building within hours. Employees who had suffered under his discriminatory management felt a sense of relief they hadn't experienced in years. Those who had witnessed his behavior but felt powerless to stop it realized that justice was still possible in corporate America. Marcus, the barista who had first warned Talia about Brian's pattern of discrimination, summed up the prevailing sentiment. Finally, someone who thought they were untouchable learned they weren't. 3 weeks later, Keisha Washington returned to Riverside Corporate Center in a senior management position. Jerome Martinez was offered a substantial promotion and a formal apology. The company implemented new oversight procedures and mandatory bias training for all supervisors. Brian Mitchell, meanwhile, struggled to find new employment. Word of his termination had spread through industry networks, and few companies were willing to hire someone with his documented history of workplace discrimination. He had spent 2 years systematically destroying the careers of talented employees based on nothing more than racial prejudice and personal cruelty. In the end, it took just 5 days for that same system of accountability to destroy his own career. Justice, it turned out, was patient, but inevitable. The woman he had poured coffee on, the intern he had tried to humiliate, the employee he had dismissed as unworthy, she had been the architect of his downfall all along. And in bringing him down, she had lifted up every employee who had suffered under his discriminatory management, proving that sometimes the best revenge is simply ensuring that bad people face consequences for their actions. Brian Mitchell learned the hardest lesson of his professional life. In a world where everyone has a voice, bullies eventually meet someone who refuses to be silenced. What's your take on workplace justice? Have you ever seen a bully finally get what they deserved? This story shows that standing up to discrimination takes courage, strategy, and sometimes a little bit of undercover investigation. Subscribe for more stories of justice prevailing over prejudice, and let me know in the comments. Do you think Brian got what he deserved, or should the consequences have been even more severe?